The summer of 1944 in Concordia, Kansas, pressed down with a relentless, humid heat, the kind that made the air shimmer above dusty fields. Beneath that vast, indifferent sky, within the barbed wire perimeter of Camp Concordia, a seemingly impossible event unfolded. A group of German tank crews, highly trained specialists, vanished. They didn't just escape, they disappeared, leaving behind only the faintest whispers of their presence. But here's the true enigma, the one that makes you pause and wonder. Why would these German prisoners of war, captured on the battlefields of Europe, take American weapons with them? Before we delve into this unsettling mystery, tell me, where in the world are you watching this story unfold from? Camp Concordia was a precise, grinding mechanism designed to house thousands of enemy combatants. Each morning, the rough texture of standard-issue denim uniforms was donned, a uniform that felt the same, whether you were a farm boy from Kansas or a Panzer Grenadier from the Eastern Front. Every prisoner had an ID card, a medical file, a detailed record of their movements, a bureaucratic paper trail meant to account for every single soul. The camp's routine was monotonous, predictable, a dull hum of existence under the watchful eyes of American guards. Yet, within this rigid system, a deliberate manipulation began to take shape, a silent operation that defied every regulation. Major Arthur Thompson, a War Department intelligence officer, would later, in a declassified memo from October 1944, use the chillingly vague phrase, special handling for technical specialists. This wasn't a standard POW transfer. It wasn't a simple escape either. The records, or rather the deliberate absence of records, painted a picture of something far more complex, a covert operation or an internal security breach that twisted the very meaning of prisoner. Imagine the sun beating down on the parade ground, the distant clatter of mess hall trays, and then the unsettling silence of missing men. What kind of special handling involved highly skilled enemy soldiers, and why was it so shrouded in secrecy? Decades later, fragments of the truth began to surface, not in grand pronouncements, but in the quiet corners of forgotten archives. A heavily redacted transfer manifest, discovered tucked away in an uncatalogued box at the National Archives, listed a specific group of German tank specialists. Their destination wasn't another established POW camp. It was an unlisted facility in the remote Arizona desert, a place of stark, unforgiving beauty. What made this transfer truly extraordinary was the accompanying inventory, an unusually large and specific cache of American small arms. Not German weapons, but American. The irony was palpable, the implications terrifying. Sheriff Brody, the local lawman in Concordia, Kansas, a man with a weathered face and a quiet demeanor, would recall, years later, the sight of unmarked trucks moving under the cover of night. He remembered an unusual frequency of military convoys on the dusty roads around the camp perimeter, movements that didn't quite fit the regular supply runs. He'd often smell the faint, metallic scent of diesel fumes lingering in the cool morning air long after the trucks were gone. The families in Germany, meanwhile, received vague, missing in action statuses, their pleas for information met with bureaucratic stonewalling. There was no corresponding repatriation paperwork, no record of their return to Germany after the war. The silence of the archive, in this case, was deafening. This initial paradox of German tank crews vanishing with American weapons wasn't a flaw in the system, but rather a deliberate manipulation of it. We have to ask, what exactly were these German tank crews doing with American weapons on American soil? And what terrifying truth did investigators uncover 5 decades later that kept this story buried for so long? The desert wind, a persistent, dry whisper, carried fine dust across the remote plains of Arizona in late 1944. Here, far from the humid fields of Kansas, an unlisted facility hummed with a different kind of wartime activity. This was the true destination of the vanished German tank crews, Instead of the monotonous routine of a POW camp, these men found themselves in a landscape of stark, unforgiving beauty, where the sun hammered down on improvised firing ranges. Dr. Evelyn Reed, a historical weapons expert who later painstakingly pieced together fragmented reports, described the scene. They weren't being interrogated, they were being trained, and not with German equipment. She noted the distinct smell of cordite from M1 Garand rifles and Thompson submachine guns, a scent alien to men accustomed to the aroma of Mauser ammunition. These weren't standard-issue American troops, but captured enemy specialists, being drilled with American small arms, their movements precise, almost mechanical, under the watchful eyes of unfamiliar American officers. What was the ultimate purpose of this extraordinary clandestine training? The heavily redacted manifest, which listed these men and their American arsenal, was merely the tip of a bureaucratic iceberg. Further digging by independent researchers decades later uncovered a series of coded telegrams from the War Department referencing Operation Phoenix. These communications, often just a few lines long, were sent not through standard military channels, but via a secure, rarely used intelligence network. One such telegram, dated November 12, 1944, from Washington, D.C. to the Arizona Desert Facility, simply stated, "Phoenix assets fully operational. Prioritize field integration." This wasn't about holding prisoners. It was about activating them. The desert floor, a canvas of baked earth and scattered rocks, or the faint indentations of tank tracks. Not the familiar wide treads of a Sherman, but the narrower, more aggressive patterns of a captured panther or tiger, brought to this desolate place for unknown reasons. The implications of German tank crews armed with American weapons operating German armor on American soil were staggering. The official story, for half a century, remained a blank page, a deliberate void. Yet whispers persisted. Sergeant Thomas Miller, a quartermaster assigned to a remote supply depot near the Arizona site, recalled the unusual requests for specialized equipment. They'd ask for things that didn't make sense for a regular training exercise. He confided in a 1978 interview, his voice raspy with age. German-specific tools, parts lists for engines we didn't even have in our inventory, alongside crates of M1 carbines. It felt off. He remembered the way the desert nights grew cold, the air crisp and dry, carrying the distant metallic clang of heavy machinery. Not the usual sounds of a domestic military base. These were not the sounds of war winding down, but of a new, unsettling chapter beginning. If you find value in these hidden chapters of history, in stories that redefine what we thought we knew, consider subscribing to WWW Stories. We're dedicated to uncovering these truths, one meticulously researched detail at a time. The special handling for technical specialists that Major Thompson mentioned was far more intricate than anyone initially imagined. It wasn't just about training. It was about re-engineering loyalties, about leveraging unparalleled expertise. Dr. Alistair Finch, a renowned military historian from Cambridge, pointed to the desperate strategic situation in late 1944. The Allies were facing a formidable, deeply entrenched enemy, he explained, and intelligence was paramount. But what if intelligence wasn't enough? What if the war demanded a more unconventional approach? The contrast between the propaganda depicting a unified, unwavering Allied front and the reality of covert operations like Phoenix was stark. The very notion of enemy soldiers being co-opted, not just for information, but for active participation, challenged the fundamental tenets of warfare. The dusty, sun-baked landscape of Arizona became a crucible for a radical experiment. But what desperate circumstances could possibly justify such a profound ethical and strategic gamble? And who within the highest echelons of power authorized such a risky, unprecedented program? The desert nights in Arizona could be brutally cold, a stark contrast to the daytime heat. Inside the sparse barracks of the unlisted facility, a different kind of chill settled over the German tank crews. Dr. Elena Petrova, a behavioral psychologist quietly seconded from the OSS to the War Department, arrived in December 1944. Her mission? To understand and, if possible, to reshape the deeply ingrained loyalties of these highly specialized prisoners. Her confidential reports, now partially declassified, speak of intense, prolonged psychological evaluations, often conducted in a small, windowless room where the only sound was the distant hum of a generator. She noted the initial defiance, the hardened expressions, and the faint, metallic scent of stale sweat that clung to the air. Petrova's methods were subtle, focusing not on coercion, but on exploiting vulnerabilities. The longing for family, the fear of indefinite imprisonment, the disillusionment with a crumbling regime. She found that for many, the promise of survival, and even a form of absolution, outweighed their oath to a cause they increasingly saw as doomed. One entry in her journal, dated January 18, 1945, details a session with a former Panzer commander, Captain Klaus Richter. Richter, initially unyielding, eventually broke down, not under duress, but after being shown photographs of his bombed-out hometown and a fabricated letter from his wife, subtly hinting at the desperation of post-war Germany. The texture of the paper, rough and ordinary, belied the extraordinary manipulation it represented. Petrova documented a complex process of psychological conditioning, carefully designed to replace one allegiance with another. It wasn't brainwashing in the crude sense, but a sophisticated reframing of their purpose, offering a new mission, a new fight, but this time against a shared enemy that was not the Allies. This program's success hinged on identifying individuals whose primary loyalty was to their craft and their comrades, rather than to an ideology. But what kind of shared enemy could compel German soldiers to fight alongside Americans, and with American weapons, on foreign soil? The authorization for such a radical program, indeed, came from the highest echelons. A recently unearthed directive from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, dated November 1944, codenamed Project Chimera, outlined the strategic imperative. It wasn't a single general or a single department, but a consensus born of extreme desperation. The directive emphasized the critical need for unconventional assets to counter specific threats that conventional forces were ill-equipped to handle. It spoke of deep penetration operations, requiring indigenous knowledge and a familiarity with enemy tactics that only former enemy combatants could possess. Imagine the hushed tones in those war rooms, the cigar smoke hanging heavy in the air. The map spread out, detailing a grim reality. The precise language of the directive spoke of surgical strikes against targets deemed mission-critical for the war's prolongation, targets that Allied intelligence struggled to pinpoint or neutralize. These targets were not always on the European front. A series of intelligence reports, cross-referenced with Project Chimera documents, revealed a growing concern within Allied command about advanced German research and development, particularly in rocketry and unconventional weapons. Dr. Elias Vance, a leading expert in clandestine warfare history at Georgetown University, pointed to the infamous V-weapons program. The Allies knew the V-2 rockets were a threat, Vance explained, but they also suspected hidden facilities, perhaps even prototype atomic research, that Hitler would deploy as a last desperate gamble. He described the palpable fear that permeated intelligence briefings, the flickering projector light illuminating blurry aerial reconnaissance photos. The paradox of using German tank crews with American weapons began to make a terrifying kind of sense. Who better to infiltrate and neutralize such facilities than men who understood the German military mindset, who could blend in, and who possessed the technical acumen to identify and disable these cutting-edge threats? The unlisted facility in the Arizona desert, therefore, became a clandestine factory for a new kind of soldier. These men, once enemies, were being forged into an instrument of precision, their unique skills repurposed. The smell of gun oil and stale coffee filled the air in the armory as they meticulously maintained their American M1 Garands and Thompson submachine guns, a stark contrast to the heavy, familiar weight of a Kar 98K. Their training wasn't just about weapon proficiency. It was about infiltration, sabotage, and rapid extraction. They learned American combat signals, practiced navigating with Allied maps, and studied the subtle nuances of German military slang and insignia to avoid detection. The aim was not to fight a conventional battle, but to execute surgical, covert operations deep behind enemy lines, targeting scientific facilities, high-value personnel, and critical infrastructure that could turn the tide of a war already costing millions of lives. But what happened to these highly specialized, re-engineered soldiers once their training was complete? And what was the terrifying consequence of their ultimate deployment? The winter of 1944 to 45 in the Ardennes forest was a brutal, unforgiving canvas of snow and ice, a stark contrast to the Arizona desert. Yet, it was into this frozen theater that the first Phoenix assets were deployed, not as conventional soldiers, but as ghosts. Their uniforms were a careful blend of salvaged German insignia and subtly altered American cold-weather gear, designed to offer just enough ambiguity to buy precious seconds. Captain Klaus Richter, the former Panzer commander whose loyalties had been carefully re-engineered, led one such team. His mission, to locate and neutralize a hidden V-2 rocket fuel depot deep within German-held territory, a facility Allied intelligence had only glimpsed through blurry aerial photographs. The biting wind carried the scent of pine and damp earth, a familiar smell to Richter. But the M1 Garand slung across his back felt cold and foreign against his gloved hand. What tactical advantage did these repurposed specialists truly offer in the brutal realities of the front lines? A declassified after-action report, stamped Top Secret Project Chimera, and dated February 1945, detailed Richter's team's infiltration. They moved under the cover of a blizzard, their footsteps muffled by thick snow, past bewildered German patrols who mistook their shadowy figures for stragglers from a retreating unit. The report, penned by an unnamed OSS field operative, highlighted the uncanny precision of their movements, their ability to navigate complex German defenses with an almost intuitive understanding. Inside the depot, the air hung heavy with the acrid smell of concentrated hydrogen peroxide and ethanol, the volatile components of rocket fuel. Their objective wasn't to destroy it outright, but to sabotage it in a way that would render it unusable for weeks without arousing immediate suspicion, buying the Allies critical time. The quiet click of American tools, used with German efficiency, was the only sound as they meticulously contaminated storage tanks. This wasn't brute force, it was surgical, almost artistic sabotage. The success of these initial missions, though never publicly acknowledged, sent ripples through the highest levels of Allied command. Dr. Elias Vance, the Georgetown historian, noted the sudden, inexplicable delays in German rocket launches reported in Allied intelligence briefings throughout early 1945. The official explanation was always technical difficulties or weather conditions, Vance stated. But the timing, the pattern, aligns perfectly with the deployment of Project Chimera teams. He pointed to a coded message from General Eisenhower's headquarters to the War Department, dated March 1945, simply stating, "Chimera yields exceeding expectations. Recommend expanded deployment." The very air in the war rooms, once thick with anxiety over V-weapon attacks, now held a faint, almost imperceptible scent of cautious optimism. The paradox of using former enemies to fight the current one was proving disturbingly effective. But what was the true human cost of this effectiveness? And how did these re-engineered loyalties hold up under extreme pressure? Dr. Elena Petrova, whose psychological conditioning had been instrumental, observed the returning teams with a clinical detachment that barely masked her own unease. Her journal entries from April 1945 speak of men profoundly changed, bearing not just the physical scars of combat, but a deeper, almost existential weariness. "They are neither German nor American," she wrote, her pen scratching against the rough paper. "But something new, forged in the crucible of a paradox. Their eyes hold the knowledge of fighting against their own, for a cause that was never truly theirs, yet became their only path to survival. She noted the way Captain Richter would often stare at his American service pistol, turning it over and over in his hands. The cold steel a constant reminder of his altered reality. The smell of cheap American cigarettes, smoked constantly, became a defining characteristic of the returning operatives. This was not a simple defection. It was a profound transformation that left them in a liminal space belonging nowhere. The psychological toll was immense. Some operatives struggled with profound identity crises, their minds fractured by the conflicting loyalties they had been forced to embrace. An internal OSS memo from May 1945, titled Phoenix Asset Retention Challenges, highlighted a disturbing trend. A significant number of operatives, once their missions were complete, simply vanished. Not back to Germany and not into Allied custody. They simply disappeared, dissolving into the chaos of post-war Europe, their records meticulously scubbed. They possessed highly specialized skills, intimate knowledge of both German and Allied intelligence methods, and no official identity, read the memo, its words stark and chilling. A dangerous combination. The scent of fear, for the program's architects, was not of betrayal, but of uncontrolled assets, ghosts without a country, carrying secrets that could unravel carefully constructed narratives. What became of these phantom soldiers, and what further secrets did their ultimate fate conceal for half a century? The end of the war in Europe in May 1945 brought a new set of challenges for Project Chimera. The immediate threat of V-weapons and advanced German R&D dissipated, but the existence of these highly trained, deniable assets remained a profound strategic dilemma. A confidential directive from the newly formed Central Intelligence Group, CIG, the precursor to the CIA, in July 1945, ordered the complete and irreversible dissolution of Project Chimera assets and records. This wasn't merely a winding down. It was an active erasure, a deliberate attempt to bury one of the war's most ethically ambiguous and strategically audacious programs. The faint metallic smell of fresh ink on these new directives underscored the urgency of the matter. These men, once valuable, were now liabilities, living contradictions to the narrative of a clear-cut victory. But how do you make highly skilled operatives who have proven their ability to disappear, vanish permanently and without a trace? The chilling answer would only emerge decades later, revealing a truth far more complex and terrifying than simple bureaucratic oversight. The confidential directive from the newly formed Central Intelligence Group in July 1945 wasn't just a suggestion. It was an ironclad mandate. The complete and irreversible dissolution of Project Chimera assets meant more than simply shredding documents or burning files. It meant making men, highly trained and deeply compromised, utterly vanish. The facility chosen for this final phase was even more remote than the Arizona desert, a cluster of dilapidated barracks in the desolate stretches of Nevada, where the dry, hot air carried the metallic tang of distant mining operations. Here, under the watchful, unsympathetic gaze of CIG operatives, the final act of erasure began. Colonel James Sterling, a man whose career was built on the art of making inconvenient truths disappear, oversaw the operation. He would later, in a heavily encrypted memo to his superiors, describe the process with chilling detachment. Assets processed as per directive, all traces eliminated. The term processed was a bureaucratic euphemism for a series of carefully orchestrated steps. For some, it meant new identities, a handful of cash, and a one-way ticket to a distant, neutral country, with explicit instructions never to return or speak of their past. They were given new names, new histories, and a stark warning. Any attempt to reconnect with their former lives or expose Project Chimera would result in immediate, severe consequences. The crisp, New banknotes they clutched felt alien in their hands, a stark contrast to the rough fabric of their repurposed uniforms. For others, particularly those deemed too unstable or too deeply entrenched in their conflicting loyalties, the dissolution took a different, darker turn. Their fate was sealed, not with a passport, but with a quiet, irreversible silence. Their bodies absorbed by the vast, anonymous landscape, their stories buried beneath layers of desert earth. No official records, no graves, just an absence. The immediate post-war years were a whirlwind of reconstruction and redefinition. The world, eager to move past the horrors, collectively swept inconvenient truths under the rug. Project Chimera became a ghost program. Its existence known only to a select few, its operatives, whether living in exile or lying in unmarked graves, becoming mere echoes. Families in Germany, still reeling from the war's devastation, continued to receive no concrete answers regarding their missing sons. The initial missing in action status quietly morphed into presumed deceased, a bureaucratic finality that offered no closure, only a lingering, cold emptiness. Sheriff Brody, back in Concordia, Kansas, eventually retired, his memories of unmarked trucks and strange convoys fading into the background hum of small-town life, dismissed as wartime oddities. The silence surrounding these men was absolute, meticulously maintained by the very intelligence agencies that had created them. Yet silence, however profound, can never truly erase every single trace. Decades later, in the mid-1990s, the first faint cracks in this carefully constructed wall of secrecy began to appear. Dr. Alastair Finch, the Cambridge military historian, who had previously analyzed the strategic desperation leading to Project Chimera, found himself sifting through a newly declassified tranche of OSS documents. Most of the files were mundane, but one particular administrative ledger, thick with dust and smelling faintly of mildew, caught his eye. It was a supply requisition from 1946, detailing a shipment of specialized disposal equipment to a remote, unlisted facility in Nevada. The coordinates matched no known military installation, and the equipment listed, industrial incinerators, heavy-duty excavation tools, seemed strangely out of place for a demobilization effort. He ran his fingers over the faint, embossed lettering on the ledger cover, a tremor of unease moving through him. This wasn't a smoking gun, not yet. It was a single, perplexing thread in a tapestry of official silence. Dr. Finch, driven by a historian's insatiable curiosity, began to cross-reference this anomaly with other obscure findings. He revisited the heavily redacted transfer manifest from the National Archives, the one that listed German tank specialists moving to Arizona with American weapons. He compared the dates, the personnel referenced, and the subtle, almost invisible patterns of bureaucratic language. He found a strange parallel, the same cryptic codes for special handling that Major Arthur Thompson had used in 1944. The dry, sterile air of the archive seemed to grow heavy, charged with unspoken narratives. What kind of disposal required industrial incinerators and excavation tools for men who were supposedly just vanishing into post-war Europe? The initial paradox of German tank crews disappearing with American weapons was now slowly giving way to a new, far more disturbing question about their ultimate fate. Dr. Finch's relentless pursuit of this anomaly led him deeper into the labyrinth of post-war intelligence. He cross-referenced the Nevada coordinates with newly declassified aerial photographs from 1947, revealing not a training facility, but a hastily constructed, isolated complex of industrial buildings, stark against the red Nevadan dust. The metallic tang of desert air, often carrying the scent of distant sagebrush, here seemed to hold a different, more unsettling odor in the historical imagination. Then a breakthrough. An obscure footnote in a memoir from a retired CIG analyst, Colonel John Markham, published privately in the late 1980s, confirmed the darkest suspicion. Markham, referring cryptically to Project Chimera's final solution, spoke of a terminal processing center where unrepatriatable assets were handled with extreme prejudice. The sheer coldness of the language, etched onto the yellowed page, was chilling. Dr. Elias Vance, reviewing Finch's findings, articulated the horrifying implication. The disposal equipment wasn't for documents. It was for people. For those who couldn't be trusted with new identities, or whose psychological conditioning had failed. The CIG enacted a policy of complete, permanent erasure. The silence of those vast desert plains now felt like a final, terrifying answer. If this recontextualization, this glimpse behind the veil of history, has made you see the war in a new light, please consider hitting the like button. It helps us know these stories resonate. The practical consequences of Project Chimera's ultimate dissolution echoed for decades within the nascent intelligence community. It cemented a dark precedent for deniable operations, where the ethical lines between enemy and asset, life and erasure, blurred completely. The program's architects, shielded by layers of secrecy, never faced public scrutiny for the fates of these men. The paradox of German tank crews disappearing with American weapons, initially a bewildering enigma, now made a terrifying kind of sense. They were repurposed, used, and then, for many, simply extinguished. Their skills too valuable, their knowledge too dangerous to ever fully reintegrate. Their stories became the ultimate casualty of a war fought not just on battlefields, but in the shadows of human consciousness and bureaucratic ruthlessness. We are left with the chilling understanding that some secrets are not just buried, but actively incinerated, leaving only the faintest whisper of a truth too horrifying to acknowledge. What other wartime secrets do you believe remain deliberately buried, waiting to be uncovered? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to keep exploring these untold chapters of history, subscribe to WWW Stories and join our ongoing investigation.